In the year 1974, in a quiet conference room in Cairo, a single Senegalese scientist walked up to a panel of the most respected Egyptologists in the world and proceeded to dismantle piece by piece a story they had been telling for over 200 years. The story that ancient Egypt, the civilization that built the pyramids, invented written language, mapped the stars, and laid the foundations of modern science, was somehow not an African civilization. By the time he finished speaking, the room was silent. The official UNESCO transcript of that meeting, which you can still read today, recorded that the panel could not refute his evidence. His name was Cheikh Anta Diop. He was a chemist, a physicist, a linguist, a historian, an anthropologist. He spoke 7 languages. He studied under some of the most brilliant minds in 20th century Europe, and he spent his entire life trying to answer one simple question that academia had refused to ask honestly. Who actually built ancient Egypt? What he discovered changed African history forever, and what European academia did to him for discovering it is a story almost no one tells. What Cheikh Anta Diop did wasn't just challenge a few ideas in a textbook. He challenged the entire foundation of how the Western world told the story of human civilization. And for that, they tried to silence him. They blocked his PhD, they mocked him in journals, they kept his work out of mainstream classrooms for decades. But the evidence he left behind is now being studied, debated, and increasingly confirmed by scientists, by geneticists, by archaeologists all over the world. So today, we are going to walk through exactly what he proved, how he proved it, and why the answer matters more now than ever before. Cheikh Anta Diop was born in 1923 in a small village called Tietou in colonial Senegal. His family was Muslim, deeply rooted in West African scholarly tradition. And from a young age, Diop showed the kind of mind that comes along once in a generation. He moved to Paris in 1946 to continue his education, and in Paris, he didn't just study one thing, he studied everything. Physics, chemistry, history, linguistics, Egyptology, philosophy, anthropology. He studied under some of the most respected scientists in France, including Frédéric Joliot-Curie, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And while he was in Paris, surrounded by the intellectual elites of post-war Europe, he began to notice something deeply troubling. Every textbook, every lecture, every museum he visited told the same story. That ancient Egypt, one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever produced, was somehow separate from Africa. That its people were Mediterranean, or Caucasoid, or mixed, or dynastic race from somewhere else. Anything except what the geography, the arts, the language, and the people themselves had been saying for thousands of years. That they were African. Diop decided he was going to find out the truth, and he was going to do it not with opinion but with science. In 1949, Cheikh Anta Diop did something no one had ever done before. He took small samples of skin tissue from ancient Egyptian mummies, preserved for thousands of years, and applied a chemical test for melanin. Melanin is the pigment that gives human skin its color. And in living tissue, melanin breaks down, but in dead tissue, preserved tissue, melanin remains. It can still be measured, even thousands of years later. What Diop found was stunning. The melanin levels in those Egyptian mummy samples were not consistent with European or Mediterranean populations. They were consistent with sub-Saharan Africans. He published his findings. He invited other scientists to repeat the tests. He offered to share his methodology with any laboratory in the world. And the response from European academia: silence, then dismissal, then refusal to even cite his work in mainstream journals. But Diop wasn't going to stop with chemistry. He had only just begun. Diop's second weapon was language. He compared the ancient Egyptian language, the language of the pharaohs, written in hieroglyphs, with the Wolof language of his native Senegal. and several other West African languages. What he found was extraordinary. Hundreds of work, grammatical structures, verb conjugations, even religious and philosophical concepts, all sharing deep, unmistakable similarities between ancient Egypt and modern West African languages. This wasn't borrowing, this wasn't trade vocabulary. This was the kind of structural similarity that only happens when two languages share a common origin. And here's what makes that finding even more powerful. The language of Europe, Greek, Latin, English, French, German, share none of these structures with ancient Egyptian. So, if ancient Egypt wasn't linguistically European and it wasn't linguistically Asian, then where did it come from? Diop's answer was simple. It came from where it was, Africa. But Diop didn't stop at chemistry and linguistics. He went to the artwork. The Egyptians left behind tens of thousands of self-portraits, statues, paintings, carvings, frescoes, depicting themselves over a span of 3,000 years. And in those depictions, especially in the earlier dynasties, the people of Egypt are shown with dark skin, with African features, with braided and locked hair. He went to the writings of the ancient Greeks themselves. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and described the Egyptians explicitly as having dark skin and woolly hair. Aristotle said the same. Diodorus Siculus said the same. The ancient Greeks, who actually saw Egyptians as a person, had no confusion about who they were. He went to the skeletal remains, studies of bone structure, skull measurements, and dental morphology from pre-dynastic and early dynastic Egyptian sites. Consistently showed greater similarity to population from the Nile Valley and tropical Africa than to populations from the Mediterranean or the Middle East. And he went to geography. Egypt sits on the Nile River. The Nile flows from out of the heart of Africa. The earliest Egyptian civilization arose in Upper Egypt, the southern part, closest to Sudan and Nubia. The pyramids were not built in a vacuum. They were built by people who came from the south, from deeper Africa. When Diop laid all of his evidence out, chemistry, linguistics, arts, written accounts, skeletal data, and geography, the picture was overwhelming. Ancient Egypt was an African civilization built by African people, with African languages, African religious systems, African aesthetic traditions. The only people who couldn't seem to accept this were the ones who had spent 2 centuries telling the world the opposite story. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. Some of Diop's specific claims remains debated in mainstream academia today. The melanin testing methods he used in the 1940s have been refined and criticized. Some of his linguistic comparisons have been challenged. Modern Egyptology takes a more cautious view, often emphasizing that ancient Egypt was diverse, with influences from across Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East, rather than belonging to any single racial category. But here's what is no longer debatable. Recent DNA studies, modern archaeological evidence, updated bone and dental analysis, they have all confirmed Diop's central thesis that ancient Egypt civilization had deep foundational roots in Africa, that its people, especially in the early dynasties, were biologically and culturally connected to the rest of the African continent. The story that ancient Egypt was somehow separated from Africa, a Mediterranean or Near Eastern civilization that just happened to be located on the African continent, that story is dead on arrival. Diop killed it, and the evidence has only grown stronger since. But the cost of being right was enormous. Diop submitted his groundbreaking PhD thesis at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1951. The thesis titled, "The Cultural Unity of Black Africa." It was rejected, not because the research was bad, but because no committee was willing to defend a black African scholar making claims that fundamentally challenged the European narrative of history. He resubmitted it again and again. He fought for 9 years. Finally, in 1960, after assembling a panel that included scholars from multiple disciplines, because no single department wanted the political risk, the Sorbonne approved his thesis. He had won, but by then he had already been quietly excluded from much of European academic life. His books were translated slowly. His invitations to international conferences were limited. His name was kept out of mainstream Egyptology textbooks for decades. Meanwhile, in Africa, he became a legend. Cheikh Anta Diop went home to Senegal. He founded the radiocarbon laboratory at the University of Dhaka, the first of its kind in Africa. He mentored generations of African scholars. He wrote book after book, The African Origin of Civilization, The African Origin of Civilization, Civilization or Barbarism, Pre-Colonial Black Africa, works that are now considered foundational texts in African studies programs around the world. He died in 1986. Today, the largest university in Senegal, Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dhaka, bears his name. Tens of thousands of students walk through his gates every year, studying the truth he fought a lifetime to prove. In 1966, the World Festival of Black Arts named him, alongside Weeb Doboa, as the scholar who had the most profound influence on 20th century African thoughts. And the question he asks, who really built ancient Egypt? It's no longer a question that can be answered with comfortable European fairy tales. Because of him, the real story is finally being told. So here's what I want you to take away from this video. History is not just a record of what happened. It is a record of who was allowed to tell the story. For 200 years, the story of ancient Egypt was told by people who had a very specific reason to keep Africa out of it. To make civilization look European. To make Black Africa look empty. Cheikh Anta Diop spent his entire life proving them wrong, with chemistry, with language, with bones, with art, with the words of the Greek themselves, and he did it while being mocked, locked, ignored, and erased. But he never stopped. And because he never stopped, every African child today can grow up knowing the truth. That the pyramids, the pharaohs, the temples, the mathematics, the medicine, the philosophy of ancient Egypt, that legacy belongs to them. If this video taught you something you didn't know, do 3 things for me. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment below telling me which historical figure do you think deserves to have their story told next. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and never let anyone tell you that history is settled. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.